Hello and welcome everyone. Aurelie, how are you?
Good, very good. And you?
Yes, very good, very good. We got people joining in at the moment. I'll ask hi. Where are you from? Great. So thanks everyone for joining another data futurology webinar. As usual, we'll have a conversation going on the chat, and we'll put questions in the Q&A section, and we'll be going through the audience questions all through the webinar. Thanks everyone for joining. So the webinar, we're going to be discussing ethics in AI. Super important topic, something that a lot of data scientists are feeling the burden, the weight on our shoulders from this topic, and Aurelie has so much knowledge to give us in this space. Getting a few highs from Melbourne. Let me see. Jason, hey mate. Smitan from Melbourne too. Big well, Ken, hi everyone. Thanks for making the time. Before we kick off, we do want to say thank you to our sponsor, which is Rubix. Rubix is a technology consulting company based in Australia, and they're helping ASX 100 organizations to get more value from their data. Feel free to reach out to them if you need any help working through any data problems. We're really thankful for Rubix to helping us on our journey. Data futurology wouldn't be possible without sponsors. So at the moment, we are looking for more sponsors. If your organization would like to sponsor us, please get in touch with myself on LinkedIn or through the website. And for individuals, we have a Patreon page where people can sponsor us as an individual. I think it's starting from like $2 a month. So that would be super helpful. And additionally, we have a partnership with Data Science Melbourne, for which later every year we run a datathon, which is a competition where people compete to do a predictive model based on data that's been supplied by an organization, and the prize money is also supplied by an organization, or by that organization that supplies the problem. If you would like to get hundreds of teams of data scientists working on a problem for your organization, please get in touch with either myself or Phil Briley from Data Science Melbourne to see how we can collaborate on the datathon that hopefully is coming later in the year. And I have a message from Anurag from Australia. Thanks, mate. Thanks for joining. Great. So with that, Aurelie, I think we should get started. And I wanted to ask you first about how you got into, first into data and data ethics. What was the journey that took you landing in that world?
Thanks for the question. It's been a couple of years to get to, since a couple of years I've got into data and ethics. I'm not a technologist. I'm a lawyer by trade, and I started as a litigator, looking at litigating across countries, and so I was quite interested in multi-jurisdiction, the laws that apply, and then that got me into working into finance for algorithmic trading. So I just got into algorithmic trading, working for a bank and looking after the trading, the execution, and the clearing of the transaction in 2008. So that was perfect timing.
Yeah.
Just the crash. So I learned a lot about what not to do, and also all the remediation action that happened following all the regulator coming down on the algorithmic traders. And this all together really piqued my interest when AI came along, because it seems like a history repeating. the first that we're looking at AI and ethics, and that's how I learned about it, was from South by Southwest, was like back in 2006, no, 2016, sorry. They started to have discussion on ethics and AI, and that piqued my interest. And I saw somehow that the law at the time, all the initiatives were done overseas. There was nothing in Australia that was done. I was trying to get into pretty much every international initiative that was arising. That's why I got into the IEEE work. And since the law was not going fast enough for me, I decided to venture in the world of standards and push for a discussion with Standard Australia and a few stakeholders, and push for Australia to participate in the international standard on AI that just started in 2017 after the Vladivostok meeting. So that's how I got involved.
Fantastic, fantastic, and there's definitely a lot for us to unpick there, because yeah, you've been involved with the IEEE, also with Springer on their AI and ethics journals, and with the AI Standards Australia. So lots. I don't know how you do it, keeping doing work across so many things. So maybe for the people that don't know about the AI Standards Australia, can you introduce the organization, the work being done on the AI front, and your role as chair?
Yes, of course. So Standard Australia provides do all the work around standardization of different topics. It goes from environment to obviously technology to the standards you have to build the houses. So what happened, there's a special committee called GTC1 that's looking at the technology aspect of the standardization. And as I say, in 2017, the international standard ISO decided to that it was valuable to start a standardization initiative on artificial intelligence. What that means is pretty much establishing best practice. And the advantage that ISO has, it's relying on existing company practice. So for example, one standard that's very famous that everyone's using in risk management is 9001. That's adopted pretty much all around the world. So from that perspective, there's a standard that's at the international level that's developed. And in Australia, we decided to, once it was decided to go with an international standard, you have people that observe, or countries that observe or participate in the standards. So Australia entered as a participant in, I think, 2018, which means that my committee, so that's lots, standards love working by number. My committee is IT043, is mirroring the work of, more numbers for you, SC42, which is SC42 is a international committee. So there's about 42 countries that are participating in the work. In our meetings, the one that we used to have face-to-face, we meet twice a year internationally. We have 150 experts that's coming for pretty much that are delegated from each of those member countries, and that are working on the standardization of AI. And my committee is providing input, the Australian input into the international standards, and also is deciding to adopt the standards that are produced by GTC1 SC42. Is your standard committee open for new members? Yes, it is. There was, as part of the standards roadmaps that Australia has put in place, So there was a standard roadmap that was launched by Standard Australia in March this year. And as part of this roadmap, there was a call for participation into the work that Standard's doing. So we are taking on new members, but if you're interested, there's also possibility to contribute, not as a committee level, but in a subgroup level. So Standards will take into account offer for participation.
That's great. That's great. We had a question from Ken asking whether the Standards Committee is open for new members. So there you go, Ken. And for anyone else interested, there are definitely areas where you can get involved. And he followed up with saying how to get in touch to get on the committees.
Ping me on LinkedIn, and I'll put you in touch with the
rest. Love it. Well done. Represent us well, Ken. The pressure's on you, mate. No, I'm joking. So I wanted to ask you about what do the standards look like? What are their some of the components that we could discuss? I know that in the case, and tell me how different they are to the ISO standards. I know that with ISO, sometimes you have to create sort of the internal company standard, and then you have to abide by your own framework or standards that you set. Are you taking a similar approach, or are there going to be standards that are more prescriptive in the AI ethics space?
So we're mirroring the international standards, so it's at that level. Obviously, after there can be always the opportunity to have adaptation or at the national level. But I think the first piece is most definitely there's so many initiatives at the moment on ethics and AI and good governance in AI, and it's you'll see anyone that works in that field to keep track of every single initiative is a full day job in itself. So effectively, that's the first piece of the puzzle. How it is structured? Well, we have 5 working groups that represent the working groups that are at the, 6 working groups that represent the structures that's followed at the ISO. So some of those working groups are more technical and some are more on the governance and on the risk piece. We have at the moment, we have all the, let's say, the first part of definition and general data framework that's been done. The work that's underway at the moment, that's kicking off, is what's called AI management system. That's also referred in the standard roadmap, and that's pathway for certification of AI system. And so that would leverage the work that's currently underway on trustworthiness, risk management, governance of AI system for organization. So there's a number of items that both technical and non-technical that will be part of that AI management system.
Yeah, that's really good, really good. And we have a question coming in asking whether there's any collaboration with the CSIRO/Data61 and their AI ethics framework.
Yes, you'd see that in their framework, they actually referred to standards as one of the tools. And obviously, we're working with the Department of Innovation when we release that roadmap. So yes, it's all working together.
That's great. That's really great. And could you give us some examples or some case studies that highlight the importance of AI ethical standards, or that highlight some of the pitfalls? Are there anything sort of any case studies or any examples out there that we could discuss through?
So at the moment, in terms of example, like more from the current work that's relevant from the standard is risk management. Obviously, how do company adapt their risk management processes for AI systems? For the governance piece, how do you make sure that your board is aware of all the risk of the AI system? From a technical perspective, obviously, bias, fairness is one of the big piece. Within one of the cases that I see, not as I can't use a use case that we have with ISO, more so a use case that I see keep coming back is how do you manage privacy, bias, and accountability? So that's currently an issue where many organizations see that in order to maintain privacy, you need to get the initial reflexes to actually get rid of the sensitive data and build proxy. There's in the research, it shows more and more now that to do this has impact on effectively on the way you are auditing and your capability to audit the algorithm. So to effectively remove sensitive attributes become more and more an issue, and there may be a valid reason to keep them in. So that's, and at the moment, there's some research that's led around, I hear that also from a lot of data scientists. How do I figure what fairness is for my use case? So that's where the standard can be quite useful. And that's where I think a multidisciplinary approach is very much needed.
That's great. No, I'm very happy to hear that, because a couple of years ago there was a trend of trying to predict bias in the data. So essentially, when you're building a predictive model to predict something that the business needs, there will be some bias there, say some racial bias, and they were saying the trend was to get rid of that bias, try to predict race out of with the data you have, try to predict race, and then whatever was most predictive, take those variables out, and then go forward and predict the actual business use case that you're going to do at the beginning. So they were trying to eliminate data that held the information that could give bias. But as you said, that definitely takes a big toll on the usefulness and the accuracy of the algorithms. Have you seen any shifts on that front? Any new adoptions of different alternatives through the AI ethics frameworks that we can look forward to?
So actually, it comes from the privacy regulator in the UK. They actually provided that you see some more and more guidelines, regulatory guidelines emerging, mostly, I'd say, overseas or international groups that are, in the case, giving some indication on what the law is going to look like. And from the privacy regulator, as in the UK, as some very good guideline of that explainability, and the UK government also puts some guidelines on auditing AI system. And they both caution on the need to keep privacy, yet that in order to fairness being one of the principles also dealt with within privacy, that you need to be particularly careful when you remove sensitive attributes, because that will that could result in an unfair outcome on individuals. So, and that goes against the accuracy principle that's under privacy. So the problem is getting stronger and stronger. I think it's still on the solution. Obviously, this is looked at the standards, can't really discuss the content of it. But if you look at what's happening, obviously, is again, the partnership of AI strongly recommended, which seems to be a logical solution, that whatever solution you use to address fairness and bias should be strongly aligned with the legal principle for fairness and bias. So fairness is not, and discrimination law, I've been here for quite a long time. So whenever a data scientist is adopting a solution to effectively assess how fair the algorithm is and use mitigation method, they should be mindful that it's in line with the approach that's taken under anti-discrimination law. So, and the partnership on AI made a very good research piece on that point too.
Yeah, that's really good. And do you have any examples that of AI ethics scenarios that might be happening, either sort of in the news or any sort of examples that we see out there that you could walk us through? What were some of the problems, what the scenario is, and for people to get a feel of a use case?
Sure. I guess this. Let me think about the most appropriate.
Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be in Australia or anything like that.
Look, I'll take the one that everyone knows. That's the most basic. For me, it's mostly a governance issue. So if you look the Twitter Tay chatbot, everyone knows about this case. What happened? It's the chatbot learning on data and adopting and changing its recommendation based on the learnings that it made. If there's no control, to be honest, it's the same as algo trading. If you don't have the right control in place, the right filters, then your output is can be problematic. So in that case, they didn't monitor the monitoring of the chatbot, and there was two problems. They didn't look at the data that could be ingested and how it could learn and the consequence and the impact it would have. So for that use case, I think since then Microsoft done an amazing job at improving and developing ethical methodology. Impact assessments now are becoming more and more common. So to do an impact assessment in that case would have been, okay, if the algorithm learn what's the impact it can have, how it's going to affect the individuals there. So looking at having a proper algorithmic impact assessment nowadays is becoming more and more common. Then obviously looking at the data it's going to ingest, like the testing it and the monitoring. That's the key basic practice. So
yeah, that makes sense. And what about when organizations don't have better data or any better data to improve the fairness or reduce bias? And there was an example late last year from health in the US, and I ask because it's quite it's a very similar scenario to some of the work that I've been involved in at the moment in health, where what happened in the US was that they had different programs to help people recover after surgery, and they had different levels of coverage that was, or different levels of support that was offered, where there was a digital channel, which was seen as sort of the base level of support. Then there was a medium level of interaction with a nurse on the phone. I think it was about once a month. And then there was a high level of interaction with a nurse on the phone that may be once a week. And people were sent to the 3 different channels according to how much savings that extra support would create for their future healthcare claims. So essentially from a healthcare payer perspective. And what came out later through a bit of research was that the expenses on healthcare were a proxy for socioeconomic factors, for socioeconomic indicators. So essentially, the richest people, and generally white people, got the most level of access to a nurse, and then people in lower socioeconomic areas, and especially sort of Latinos and African Americans, they were being sent down the digital channel. And in that case, it was because the health fund or the health payer, being a sort of a health insurer, had the information about what type of health people were claiming on, and then they were trying to use that to predict the savings that each individual person could get as a result of a higher support program. But the problem there was that the spend on healthcare is a proxy for socioeconomic indicators. But in that case, it's kind of like how the company runs. So it was definitely a bad blind spot and something that could be improved. But then what is your view on how that can be done better?
So is that your question about how to acquire more data? So you have a more, you don't have any blind spots?
So one option, and whether it's the recommended option, is to acquire more data about individuals and trying to avoid that that proxy or using the claims information as a proxy for socioeconomic information. Whether the I guess a better path is to acquire more data, or is it more understanding the data that's going to the system, or are there other things that could be considered or should be considered from a ethical framework perspective?
So from that perspective, obviously, the data first help to have a better picture of your customer. So if you don't have that, it's always problematic. You see a number of governments that's trying to change their legislation. Recently, France and India are looking at data sovereignty in different ways. So they actually looking at sharing data for trying to compete, let's say, with the big tech company, and to limit that competitive advantage by ensuring that data can be shared between company if they have a strong benefit for individuals. So you'll see that there's in most of the ethics principle at the moment, there are 2 principles at least out of the one on their list that is dedicated to benefiting society. So leveraging on that, you see the next piece of legislation that says, if you can do this, then there's a possibility to share the data for the benefit of the individuals, and to effectively ensure that everyone has more open access to the data. The second way to do it, obviously, is consent. So, but for this, you need to be trusted. And with the amount of data breach that's currently occurring, it's more, well, the climate is less in favor of organization, but this is why trust is essential. And building good mechanism in the first place will actually help gain or regain that trust. So that's the first part on the data. The second, obviously, is having good risk management practices, just testing your algorithm, just the output mostly, reverse stress testing it. So that are some of the key basic element. And to be honest, also user experience, right? So there's a lot of good work that's been done with user design. In Australia, we did a workshop where we were looking at AI that's used to help people with mental disability. You could have all the data you want if you didn't have stakeholders that don't understand, or if we didn't have the experts that had the background about mental disability and the history and of it, you would have built, let's say, not the right experience for the right person. So knowing the rules and the context in which you're going to intervene with your algorithm is extremely important. And this has been reflected to, as you see, in a way, the AI ethics principles are strongly inspired from bioethics principles. So it's a bit now, there's more and more government are inclined to align data research to health research. So going a little bit more that way.
Interesting. That's really, really interesting. And do you have a view of where this function should sit in an organization? Understanding that across the board of sort of whoever is working with data or around data will have some part to play around an ethical use of data and AI. But is there a certain part of the organization that would be better suited to sort of take the lead on embedding these principles across the organization? Is it a function that exists or something new? Where do you see it sitting in an organization?
This will depend on the organization. So there's not one model that fit all. It's generally one thing that's obvious is it should not sit just this is what we're discussing. This is not just the responsibility of the data scientists to effectively have to decide whether it's ethical or not. There's all the mechanisms that can be used within an organization to assess those ethical risk, and it's more if depending on the capabilities that one has, whether enhancing the existing risk, legal compliance, and human rights mechanisms that exist to actually leverage that for AI system. So that's it should never be the data scientist on its own making the call. For the one reason that they specialize in data science, and to decide what's fair and what's not should not be resting on the shoulder of one person.
I agree. Yeah, I think there'll be a sign of relief by many people in hearing that. Sorry to interrupt.
Obviously, some organization, mostly the one that are creating and developing AI system, have used ethics advisory board. So these are the organizations that have mostly been setting new advisory committee dedicated to ethics, or the one that are also where there's a high impact, like in health. That's the one that have taken that steps. At the moment, if you look at the other organization, it's mostly leveraging their risk, the legal department, obviously also the knowledge of their tech department, and the human rights capabilities that are currently available.
Yeah, yeah, really nice, really nice. And we'll take a couple questions from that have been coming in from the Q&A and from the audience. The first one is from Anurag, and he's asking, can you share any insights on quantitative ways to cover bias and privacy for organizations? So are there any ways to start to measure the bias, start to measure levels of privacy and being able to, I guess, show that you're making improvements on what was there before?
I'd say that from what I've seen, there's a tendency to think that if you show that it's and that's my personal observation, that if you show that you are doing as well as the individuals would do without any high system, you should be fine. I think at the moment there's a need to show it's doing better. It's because your average person, if you look at law again, when they're looking at whether the conduct was reasonable, it's looking not as the average person, it's looking at the best person. Let's say we have, it's in law, it's a person from the Clapham bus, but what it means is someone of a higher standing in society, ethical standing, that would be able to make the right call in the right circumstances. So that's why in your code of conduct, you already set the standards for individuals, and your algorithm will have to abide by the same standard as the one set in your code of conduct. So, which is, again, the interesting interaction between what the law requires, which is that level of standard of the code of conduct, which is not measuring, I have 100 people doing it this way, therefore, if I do it the same way, that's going to be the ethical or the reasonable approach to adopt. So that's how do you encode, like the question is, how do you make sure that your algorithm are actually in line with the code of conduct that are actually setting the bars for the way the decision making should be made.
Right. So in this case, when you say the algorithm has to be better, it needs to be better from an ethical perspective, not from a performance of the algorithm, or not better from a standpoint of solving the business problem better. It's from an ethical perspective. Is that right?
From a legal and an ethical perspective, because your code of conduct would say you should never do X, Y, Z as an individual because it's setting the bar for that human behavior. So the tendency is to say the performance in terms of the way it should make recommendation should be equivalent, should be no better than the one of that's done currently by individuals. But this is not the right way to measure it. It's really the standards that are set by the law, and that's reproduced in the code of conduct.
Right.
So, going back to your question, yes, it's not the performance, it's more the governance piece again.
So then any algorithm making decisions that are that need an ethical oversight, then they must be essentially more ethical and more fair than the decisions that would be currently being made by people or machines, if there are any machines doing it at the moment.
Yeah, yes. in that you should refer to your code of conduct rather than at what people are currently doing.
And then the code of conduct, is that defined internally in an organization?
Generally, yes. For the bigger organization, most definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one of those scenarios that where you define the approach internally, and then you have to, you know, abide by it internally, and that your, I guess, some sort of certification might rely on you abiding by doing what you say you were gonna do.
Yes, so you need to ensure, so generally the new piece that comes in is that you need to ensure alignment of your algorithm with the values promoted by your company, because you have already the values in relation to beneficence that are already embedded in the value and the purpose of the company. So from a standardization perspective, that's how it's been tackled.
Right. And what about for the companies, organizations that need to create a code of conduct or an ethical AI framework? What do you recommend for them? Where is a good place to start?
So the Australia's, the federal government at the moment proposed 8 AI ethics principles, and they're testing it. So that's one good place to start. MIT also did a very good analysis of all the principles that have been adopted or proposed all around the world. And you'll see there's generally a very strong commonality: fairness, accountability, and fairness, accountability are one of the, and transparency are the key ones that are pretty much across all the principles that have been adopted or recognized around the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there was a question. There was a question here around the explainability piece from Smitan, who says, with the advancement of neural networks, which is not explainable to a large extent, will this lead to a shift for more advanced models to simpler models, which can be explained but do not achieve high accuracy?
So it will depend on your choice. From my position, what I see is there will always be a need to explain, not necessarily the model. So it will be explaining the process, because in the end, you always need to be in control. So if you can't explain what the model do, you need to be able to explain what's the control you put in place, how you trained the model, and what it was reasonable to do, what you did with the algorithm, and what was a relevant control you put in place to make sure you had the right output. And again, this is where you have explainability. It's maybe a very simple example as a comparison. If you train, let's say, an animal to do X, Y, Z, you're not trying to reconstitute. You go around and you look at what training was done, how do you make sure that it was safe to train the animal in X, Y, Z environment. This is quite simplistic, but actually that's the similar logic that's applied. So, and if you can't explain, the interesting piece is at the moment the EU just provided a report. The European Union Commission had a report on AI liability, and in a nutshell, what they said, if it's too difficult for an individual to be able to show that, to actually have the evidence to show that harm was caused by the algorithm, because it's a black box, it's too difficult. What will happen is they're suggesting that the onus go on the corporation or the organization that are using the AI system to show that it has the right process in place, and therefore they were the organization was not responsible. So in a nutshell, it's shifting to you're guilty until proven innocent from an organization perspective. So if you put the two together, you just go, I better explain. So that actually I give the opportunity and better allow people to contest and understand what my algorithm is doing, so that you don't go down this other avenue, which is where the regulator is saying, if it's too hard for them to find the right evidence to make the case, then all the evidence will be back onto you to prove that you had nothing wrong. You did nothing wrong.
It's so interesting because we definitely don't want the AI systems to perpetuate the type of decisions that we have been making, that humans have been making historically, because we know that there's so much inherent bias in those decisions, in the way that society is built and run, in the decisions that humans make every day. There's so much bias in those decisions. So as we create AI systems, we definitely want to do a review and kind of like a hard reset on what should this decision look like in the world that we want to build in the future, in a fairer world, in a more transparent world. I completely see the need for that, and it's so important to to be firm and be able to bring that world into fruition and into reality. On the other side, from a more technical perspective, there's a lot of advancements in machine learning and in AI, advancements that can bring so much value to the world, but that they are not necessarily explainable. And it's definitely like a trade-off between the two of we can have certainty in how we make the decisions, so we know that we're making more ethical and fairer decisions than what we did before. But then a lot of people would feel that we're missing out on a lot of the value that a lot of the new developments in the technology can provide. So it's obviously really interesting and tricky situation where people would be very passionate about both sides of the argument.
And it's back to my initial point, right? If you're doing research, as long as you're taking proper precaution and you have good governance and you making sure people stay safe, you don't need to have that's the focus on, and that's where the legislator are focusing with explainability. Obviously, if you can trace and track and go through all the explanation for the algorithm, that's better. But even if you go back to algo trading, right, one of the issue is to prove intent to trade. When it's the algorithm that does the trading, how do you show intent? That was a big issue. So again, it's looking at the process around and not necessarily having to decompose the algorithm. There was a recent decision where the ACCC look at Trivago and its use of its algorithm, the way they did to test it, to understand whether the claims that Trivago was making, that the algorithm was promoting the best offer to the individuals, was actually not by opening and the black box and trying to figure out what happened in there. It's by doing testing, having test data and see what was the output of the algorithm. So that's why that's how at the moment we're looking at explainability from my perspective.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. It's the problem, at least from a technical perspective, it gets complicated easily because as data sets have been growing, when you have even a couple hundred variables that are being inputted into a system. And if you have a couple of million records or a few million records, that high dimensional space becomes so sparsely populated that essentially you would need it's something like you would need more a high number higher than the number of atoms in the universe in order to populate this high dimensional plane in a manner that is sort of well populated enough, dense enough to be able to cover all possible cases, because you have so many dimensions to try and fill out. So there's really a limitation where the algorithm has to make, you know, a best kind of like a best guess, which is the mathematics behind it, but the best guess of how to fill the gaps, that there's so many gaps in a high dimensional space when data is limited, which it always will be regardless of how big it is. So it gets really interesting really fast. We have a question from Derek that he's asking about the trade-offs between benefiting society and whether how much does that mean that the rights of the individual can get trampled on. So if there's something that is that that it's sort of good for the many, but that might trample on the privacy of the few. Is that something that in the AI ethics standards that you've seen either here or overseas, whether things like that are being taken into consideration, which is kind of like we could have a totally safe society if we tracked the movements of every person all the time, 24/7, we would be like super safe, but privacy-wise, we would be very low on privacy. Have you heard or come across any scenarios like that from an AI ethics perspective?
So not an ethicist, but I'll put that as a cover. So obviously you have all the different theory on value ethics, consequentialism, which one is the best to choose. I'm not looking at solving these issues. I leave to the ethicists. They're a much better place. What I can say is from a legal perspective, you in order to manage this, you've already got mechanisms in place you can use. This is not a new problem. So if you want to have access to data, again, back to my issue, like what I mentioned before, you need to manage it properly, obtain the consent of the person, and that's one way to acquire the data and make sure, and to have more data, you'll need a number of consent. So that's a longer way, the more difficult way, but that's where you need to adapt to the benefit of one versus the multiplicity. And you have a number of laws currently in place that explains really what is acceptable for everyone. So in that case, that's the right standards to apply. When you come across more something that's outside the law, and you have the ethical conundrum, you see what that's where you've got what's the health in the health sectors. You've got quite developed ethical boards that are looking at those issues currently. You just see even for WHO, the World Health Organization, they actually set up for coronavirus. There's ethical impact assessment, so that's what they've drawn. Obviously, this is something that's developing in for data scientists. So far, the mechanism that they look to assess beneficence or impact on society is really you see there's A couple of organizations that have advocated for the risk, impact assessments of algorithms. The United Nations has indicated that they're going to work on developing risk impact assessment for algorithm, and that they're going to have some guidance. So this piece of work is still very complex and being developed.
Yeah, really, really complex. Really, really complex. And we have a question from Jason. Hey, mate. Whether any code of conducts that an organization creates, they need to be approved by an independent body?
So you would have, it's the values. So you've got some might be mandated, some not. It's just there's a variety depending on, again, on the type of organization. But generally, you have companies that have their purpose, their corporate value. You'd see that any of the big technology provider, whether it's Google, Microsoft, IBM, etc., they have their core values, their purpose, and generally they have to be aligned with the location in which they are. So this is generally, this exercise has been done again for, you have a number of organizations that already have human rights division that's look after inclusion, discrimination, etc. This is nothing new. And again, talking generally, there would have some organization would also do have a sustainability report to provide. So these are already in place for quite a number of organizations. For the smaller, obviously not, but that's where that's generally when for the startup, they always have to start with developing their purpose and with developing the principles that they abide with. Again, one good example, maybe just retracing back to one thing said before, when we looked at AI ethics and using AI to help people with mental disability, one of the very, very important point was that we needed to agree on what was the goals that we wanted to achieve, what was important to improve, to make an improvement to the life of those individuals, and have very clear guidelines on this. So those goals, like obviously you have the company goals, but also through projects, that's the tendency is to think, oh, I need to get the data first, and I need to think about the ROI, etc. But you also need to set up very, very clear guidelines and goals on what is going to be acceptable and not acceptable, and being able to track this throughout the project. And this should be done before the project starts at the very beginning.
Yeah, I agree. It's a high bar, increasingly necessary bar, but there's always the trade-off about the I guess the impact on innovation and speed. But it's necessary if we wanna build a better society.
And to be honest, I'm not sure it's such a trade-off, because if you built it early, you won't have to retrofit it down the track. So what you see currently with legal being involved later down the piece, or compliance, is often those requirements are a bit later on. And if you involve them in the first place, I know there's always a bit of, let's say, collaboration work that needs to be increased on both sides. But what's happening is, the more, especially for AI, because you have to do all the training, etc., and that takes already a long time. It's better to start at the very beginning, so you don't have to retrain your algorithm closer to the deployment stage, which would be, to be honest, from just from a financial perspective, not very efficient. So.
Oh, I thought when you were talking about training, I thought you meant the training of the people involved, like of legal and compliance. That takes a long time. I've found. Yeah, there ideally needs to be a balance, but I totally agree that this is necessary, and it needs to be done and brought in and done right. I don't know what that right looks like, but it's a tricky, and that's I guess why we have great people such as yourself working on helping us see the light and get through this. So I'm really glad that you are, and thank you for doing that work, and thank you so much for sharing all these perspective and ethical dilemmas with us. It's definitely a lot for us to to consider and bring into our work, and we can definitely build a better society by taking on these principles.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining, and definitely go and check out the AI ethical framework from the government, and then soon coming out from the standards from Standards Australia AI ethical guidelines and framework. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you at the next webinar here in a couple of weeks. Thanks everyone. Take care. Thank you so much, Aurelie.
Thanks
Thank
a lot.
you.
Okay, bye.
Bye everyone.